Her hand was still clutching them, even asleep. 2 pay stubs, 2 jobs, 1 exhausted woman. The last bus of the night rattled past empty streets, and she'd missed her stop 3 stops ago. He almost didn't wake her. He almost just sat down and rode past his own stop instead. But here's what nobody expected. The man who gently tapped her shoulder that night wasn't just another passenger. He was one of the wealthiest men in the state, riding public transit alone, at midnight, for a reason he hadn't told a single person in his life. Renata Voss was 32 years old, and by the time that bus rolled through downtown at 11:45 that night, she had been awake for 19 hours straight. She worked mornings at a hospital laundry facility, folding sheets and scrubs on an assembly line that started at 5 a.m., and she worked nights at a 24-hour diner off Route 12, taking the closing shift 4 nights a week, because it paid $2 more an hour than the earlier ones. In between, she was raising her 7-year-old son, Micah, mostly alone, with occasional help from a neighbor who watched him after school, for a modest fee Renata could barely afford but couldn't survive without. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. She never meant to. But some nights, the exhaustion simply won, her body shutting down the second she sat in a bus and let her guard drop for the first time in 19 hours. In her hand, tucked into a small fold, were 2 pay stubs from that week, 1 from the hospital laundry facility, 1 from the diner. Numbers she'd been quietly doing math against in her head for weeks, trying to figure out how she was going to cover Micah's new winter coat and the overdue portion of last month's rent at the same time. The man who sat 2 rows behind her that night was named Julian Castellane, though almost nobody on that bus would have recognized the name, and even fewer would have believed that the unremarkable man in a plain gray coat, riding the last bus of the night with no briefcase and no entourage, was the founder and majority owner of Castellane Industries, a logistics and manufacturing empire worth well over $4 billion. Julian rode public transit at night, roughly once a month, a habit almost nobody in his professional life knew about. Not his board, not his executive team, not even his closest friends. He'd started it 3 years earlier, in the raw aftermath of losing his younger sister to a sudden illness, a loss that had left him restlessly awake most nights, and increasingly suspicious of how disconnected his enormous success had made him from the actual lives of the people his companies, L's decisions, affected every single day. Riding the bus at midnight wasn't performance. It wasn't charity tourism. It was, in his own private words to himself, remembering what real looks like. What Julian didn't know, sitting 2 rows behind Renata that particular Tuesday night, was that Castellane Industries, his own company, the one bearing his family name, had, 6 months earlier, approved a routine cost-cutting measure at a subsidiary hospital services contractor that had quietly reduced overnight shift differentials for laundry facility workers across 4 regional hospitals. It was the kind of decision that moved through corporate layers so many times it barely entries connaissance. That Wade was Durlormain, but the Chizduf, Raktuf, the laws of physics, res longer document, approved in the same meeting as decisions about warehouse logistics and fleet maintenance schedules. He had no idea that the sleeping woman 2 rows ahead of him, clutching 2 pay stubs in her exhausted fist, was one of the exact workers that decision had quietly affected. And then, it all changed. The bus reached the end of its regular route, and the driver called back through the mostly empty vehicle that this was the final stop. Renata didn't stir. Julian watched her for a long moment, debating whether to simply let the driver handle it, before something made him stand up and walk the 2 rows forward himself. "Ma'am," he said gently, crouching slightly to her eye level, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm sorry to wake you. This is the last stop." Renata's eyes snapped open, disoriented, her hand instinctively tightening around the 2 folded papers in her fist before she'd even fully registered where she was. Oh no," she said, sitting up fast, panic flashing across her face. "What time is it? I need to. My son. It's almost midnight, Julian said, stepping back to give her space. I think you missed your stop a while ago. Renata scrambled to gather her things, and in her haste, one of the 2 pay stubs slipped from her hand and fluttered to the bus floor, landing face up directly in front of Julian's shoes. Julian bent down instinctively and picked it up before she could reach it, intending only to hand it back. But as he straightened, his eyes caught the printed numbers on the stub for half a second longer than he meant to. The hourly rate, the shift differential line item, reduced from what it should have been. The employer name printed clearly at the top. Meridian Hospital Services, a subsidiary he recognized instantly, because it was one of dozens of subsidiaries that ultimately reported, through several layers of ownership, straight back to him. This is yours, he said quietly, handing it back, his voice carefully neutral, even as something cold settled in his chest. Thank you, Renata said, tucking both stubs quickly into her coat pocket, embarrassed, exhausted, clearly wanting nothing more than to get off this bus and figure out how she was getting home. I'm sorry, I need to call someone. I missed my stop by a lot. Can I ask, Julian said, before he could stop himself, where you work? I noticed the name on that stub, Meridian Hospital Services. Renata looked at him warily, the particular wariness of a tired woman being asked personal questions by a stranger on an empty bus at midnight. I work laundry services at County General, she said carefully. Why? I own the company that owns that contract, Julian said finally, quietly, watching her face carefully for the reaction he half expected. Anger, disbelief, maybe even fear of losing her job for saying something wrong to the wrong person. Castellane Industries. Meridian Hospital Services is one of our subsidiaries. Renata's expression shifted through several stages in rapid succession. Confusion, then disbelief, then something harder, something that had clearly been sitting under the surface for a long time. You're Julian Castellane, she said slowly. Not quite a question. You cut our shift differential 6 months ago. Half my coworkers had to pick up second jobs after that. I had to pick up a second job after that. I didn't know that, Julian said, and it was, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely true. A genuine, uncomfortable admission from a man used to knowing everything about everything under his company's not his umbrella. I approved a document. I didn't approve knowing what it did to real people. That's the problem, isn't it? Renata said, exhaustion giving way to something sharper, something she clearly hadn't planned to say out loud to a billionaire on a midnight bus, but couldn't hold back anymore. You people approve documents. We live the documents. I'm awake 19 hours a day because of a line item you probably spent 30 seconds looking at. Julian sat down in the seat across from her, not because he had a plan, but because he suddenly, urgently, did not want this conversation to end at the bus stop. Over the next 40 minutes, as the bus driver waited patiently, and Renata eventually called her neighbor to check on Micah, Julian asked question after question, not performative ones, not the kind executives ask when they're building a talking point for a shareholder meeting, but real ones. How many hours did she actually work each week? What her rent cost? What the shift differential cut had actually meant in dollars, month over month? For a family already stretched to its absolute limit. He wrote almost nothing down. He simply listened, in a way that made Renata, cautiously, begin to believe he actually meant it. I need you to know something, Julian said eventually, as the bus finally pulled up near her actual neighborhood, the driver having quietly extended the route without complaint. This isn't going to be a story where I hand you cash and disappear and feel good about myself. I want to fix the actual thing that's broken. Will you let me do that properly? Renata studied him for a long moment, still wary, still exhausted, but something in her expression had shifted from suspicion toward cautious, unfamiliar hope. Fix it for everyone, she said. Not just me. That's the only version of this I'll say yes to. Julian didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table until sunrise, pulling up every document connected to the shift differential decision, tracing it back through the layers of subsidiary management that had made it feel, at the time, like an unremarkable cost-saving adjustment, rather than a decision that had reached directly into the exhausted hands of a woman clutching 2 pay stubs on a midnight bus. Within a week, Julian called an emergency review of every cost-cutting measure passed at Meridian Hospital Services and its sister subsidiaries over the previous 18 months. What he found sobered him in a way no quarterly earnings report ever had. The shift differential, cut Renata had described, was one of 11 similar adjustments across the company's healthcare services division, collectively affecting over 600 overnight and weekend workers, each reduction small enough on paper to avoid real scrutiny, each one landing, in aggregate, on the backs of people working the hardest, least visible hours in the entire organization. Julian reversed every one of those cuts within 30 days, retroactive to the date they'd taken effect, with back pay issued to every affected employee. But he didn't stop there. He restructured the entire approval process for any policy touching frontline wages or benefits, requiring, going forward, a direct review and sign-off from a rotating panel of frontline workers themselves before any such change could take effect. A structural change that made national business news not for its cost, which was modest by the company's standards, but for how unusual it was for a company that size to hand that kind of veto power to the people, actually living the consequences of executive decisions. Renata received a call 3 weeks after that midnight bus ride, not from Julian directly, but from Meridian's HR department, informing her that her shift differential had been restored and back paid, and that she'd been invited, if she was willing, to sit on the newly formed frontline advisory panel, a paid role, built into her existing schedule rather than added on top of it, specifically designed so accepting it wouldn't cost her a third exhausting shift. The meaning moment came 2 months later, when Julian, quietly and without cameras, rode the same bus route again, on the same night of the week, and found Renata sitting 3 rows from the front, not asleep this time, but reading a policy document from the advisory panel, a highlighter in hand, her posture noticeably less depleted than it had been that first night. "You didn't need the second job anymore," Julian said, more observation than question. "I kept it anyway," Renata said. "For now, but it's a choice this time, not survival." She looked at him for a moment. "You actually did it. Fixed it for everyone." "You made me look," Julian said quietly. "I just did the part that was already mine to do." Added